I have a few introductory slides on behalf of European Hematology Association and European School of Hematology. What are these hematology tutorials? These are courses with the aim to provide laboratory and clinical hematologists with an integrated diagnostic and clinical workup on hematological disorders. This project started in Rome in 2004 with support of funding from the European Commission and the Marie Curie Action Program. And the idea of these courses was to use the new technical device to make courses more interactive. At the beginning, there were computers in the room. But after tutorials became very popular, it was really difficult to organize everywhere in the world rooms with computers, so we moved to the voting box systems, which in any case allow interactivity with the speakers. And as Edward said before, these courses are organized with frontal lectures, clinical cases that are diagnostic workups of real clinical cases, and test cases that are a sequence of 6 questions, and you can answer by using the voting box system, and then we can in a real time discuss the results of this test. Type 1 we started with what we now call type 1 tutorials. That means a course with original material. After tutorials became popular, they asked to get tutorials in other countries, and we thought about type 2 and type 3 tutorials. That means that the lectures are provided by speakers, and the educational material, clinical case and test cases came from the library of the HICA website, ETOL. And okay, this is the situation. From 2004, this is tutorial number 19. From 2004, we carried out all this tutorial, and you see in different areas worldwide. And at the end, until past tutorials, we had more than 1,000 participants coming from 47 different countries from all the 5 continents. And I have to check your list, Edward, to find if and I believe that there is a new country from Africa. So we are after this tutorial we are going to increase the number of the countries. And for the present year 2011, we already had the type 2 tutorial in Tel Aviv in February, and now we are starting with this tutorial in Tallinn on myeloid, and in July we will have a type 2 tutorial in St. Petersburg on myeloid again. While the type 1 tutorial that once a year is now planned in November in Prague and is focused on MDS. And in November we will have another type 2 that is on it's a mixed type concerning topics, because there are hemoglobinopathies and acute leukemia and some chronic lymphoid leukemia. So this is all for the 2011. Here there is a slide where there are highlighted the educational event organized, planned for the year 2011 from the European Hematology Association, and the highlights of the Congress and the scientific workshop on hemato-oncology pediatrics. And there is another ICAESH joint education events that is scientific workshop in October on molecular aspect of acute myeloid leukemia. I wish to point your attention on the website of the European Hematology Association. Here you find clinical case and self-evaluation cases, and every 4 months, every 3 months, 4 new clinical test cases are uploaded, and you can earn CME credit points all over the year. And so I invite you to join the Untitled platform, which is freely available at the EHI website. And I hope that you will have a very fruitful tutorial. I can start with my presentation, which is focused on myelodysplasia from the morphological aspects. Myelodysplastic syndromes are clonal neoplastic disorders which are characterized by simultaneous proliferation and apoptosis of hematopoietic cells, and this is an ineffective hematopoiesis. In peripheral blood, we have cytopenias, and according to the IPPS score, we have threshold. Hemoglobin less than 10 grams per liter, nucleated cells less than 1.8 liter, and platelet less than 1,000 liter. But this is important, these thresholds are not exclusionary, and we will see in detail some cases. And again, to define myelodysplastic syndromes, we should have a dysplasia in one or more of the 3 myeloid lineages. And to complete the framework of these pathologies, these are syndromes with an increased risk of development of an acute myeloid leukemia. We have some problems sometimes in make the diagnosis of MDS. First of all, there are some cases with the clinical and laboratory findings that are associated with unconclusive morphological findings, or vice versa. Secondly, we should exclude secondary myelodysplasia. We know that from the morphological point of view, we have several clinical settings in which blood cell can show dysplastic aspects. And first of all the nutritional deficiency. Think about B12 deficiency, or toxins, or medications. Growth factor therapy, inflammation, infection. In all these situations, the patients could show dysplastic features in hair on his blood cell. Other diagnostic problems concern when cases with hypocellular bone marrow, and cases with MDS associated with myelofibrosis. And finally, we should exclude from this group all those cases with congenital dysplastic abnormalities, such as the congenital dyserythropoietic anemias. In the new WHO classification, we have very detailed quantitative recommendation in performing the diagnostic pathway at microscope. First of all, is well underlined that in the setting of a diagnostic contest, we should perform a differential on peripheral blood out of 200 of cells. And this is very important to obtain accuracy and reproducibility, especially in the case with a low percentage of blast. Moving to the bone marrow aspirate, again, in this in the report or in this classification 2008 is well underlined that manual differential should be performed on at least 500 nucleated cells. And in the myelogram view, we have to include and to enumerate blasts and promonocytes, promyelocyte, myelocyte, metamyelocytes, band neutrophils and segmented neutrophils, eosinophil as well, basophil, monocytes. In this classification, mast cells are definitively put into the myeloid context, and in the myelogram we should include lymphocytes and erythroid precursors. Megakaryocytes obviously are not included, but this is well underlined this document, and this is the first time that a document that is prepared for clinician do include a recommendation that already existed in the documents of the international standard for standardization in hematology, such as the ISH. But now these recommendations are included. This is a slide from an old experimental work done by a group of from German in 1974, and this is very interesting to follow because here you have the aliquots or bone marrow fluid and the number of nucleated red cells. And you see that if you use to perform the smears from bone marrow aspirates less than 0.5 milliliter, you have in your sample the highest number of nucleated red cells. So this means that until rules provided from the official documents state that you should classify different subtypes of MDS or should classify sample as leukemias based on the blast count, you should use a good sample of bone marrow fluid. So to harmonize this, the recommendation is to use the first small aliquot for smears and then the other aliquots for flow, cytogenetics, and whatever else. This part is very interesting because if you collect a sample more, if you increase the milliliter of the bone marrow aspirate, you see this is the number of segmented cells of polymorphonuclear neutrophils. And so you see that when you increase the aliquot of bone marrow aspirate, you increase the contamination with peripheral blood. So you lose the amount, you dilute the granulocyte precursors. So at the end of the study, you have a smear which is not representative of what is the bone marrow cellularity. So this is a very important to perform or to teach to people who perform bone marrow aspirate to prepare smears with the small first aliquot. And here there are published, this is the reference of the ICSH guidelines for standardization of bone marrow specimens, and it was published on the International Laboratory of Hematology Journal in 2008, and all the recommendation reported in WHO classification are included in these well-done documents. Moving back to the WHO classification, the second point of quantitative recommendation which are provided in this document is the detail on what we should consider blast cell and how many blast cells we should have to define the the diagnostic subset. From the FAB classification, which started in 1976, the blast percentage remains a major factor in diagnosis, subclassification, and prognosis of hematologic malignancies. Definition of the blast cell is still based on the same one proposed by the FAB group, but it's really unclear whether this methodology has been applied in the same manner worldwide. Respect to the FAB classification, we know that with the previous, starting from the previous edition of the WHO classification, the threshold for defining acute myeloid leukemias is a blast count of 20%, while at the FAB era it was 30%. Second point is that in the WHO classification, RIB has been subdivided into two groups according to the blast percentage. RIB type 1, blast percentage 5 to 9, type 2, 10 to 19. So it's very clear that it's important to stratify patients in the same way all over the world. We should have rules and we should follow the same rules. Again, we have other recommendation in the classification. One recommendation is that flow cytometry determination of blast cells should not be used as a substitute of the microscope blast enumeration. And this is not. This is due to the fact that up to now the rules to stratify patients are based on the number of blasts we count at the microscope. So the point is that if we in the future will change the rule, we could also adopt the flow blast count. But up to now, the blast count for the diagnosis is those obtained by the microscope. Obviously, there are several cases in which flow count it's important for the diagnosis. All the cases with hypoplastic, hypocellular marrow, the strong diagnostic potential of immunochemistry to define ALIP or to define percentage of blast in bone marrow aspirates which are not available from the point of view of the microscope. Another recommendation is that myeloblasts, monoblasts, and megakaryoblast should be included into the counts. If you remember the previous slide, megakaryocytes are not included in the myelogram, but megakaryoblast should be included into blast count. And other details are that erythroblasts should be considered blast equivalent only in the context of the pure acute erythroid leukemia. Promonocytes are considered monoblast equivalent when the percentage is tallied for the diagnosis of acute monoblastic, acute monocytic, or myelomonocytic leukemia. And this is a critical point to differentiate from a morphological point of view atypical versus mature monocytes versus promonocytes. And we will go back on this point. And the other point that was well known but is important to underline is that small dysplastic megakaryocytes and micromegakaryocytes are not considered as blast cells, so should not included in the myelograms. And finally, the abnormal promyelocyte with or without overroads is considered the blast equivalent in the context of acute promyelocytic leukemia. This is a slide from the paper of the FAB, and in the new classification, in the new WHO classification, this pathway is recommended. We will go through this because I don't know how many of you do perform percentage in the NEC context or in the ANC context. So we will go in detail. Respect to the original paper, nowadays we need the blast percentage of 20% as a threshold in the diagnostic pathway between MDS and in the differentiation between MDS and acute myeloid leukemia. So we have bone marrow aspiration and we do perform our myelogram. At this point we have the leukoerythroid ratio. Usually leuco compounds is greater than erythroid compounds. So the ratio is a positive. So if after we performed our myelogram we will have erythroblasts that are more or as 50% of all the cells counted into the myelogram, we use the blast we use the blast percentage in out of the erythroblast compound that are the blast percentage of the non-erythroid cells. If this number is less than 20%, we are in the context of MDS. If it's more than 20%, we are in the context of acute myeloid leukemia. On the other side, if we have, as usually we have, erythroid percentage less than 50% for the diagnostic pathway, we will use the blast percentage out of the all nucleated cells. And in this slide, I have reported 3 different myelograms to show how it's important for the final diagnosis to follow this pathway. In the first one, we have a granulocytic series of 50%, blast percentage 20%, erythroid 25 for lymphocyte, 1 plasma cell. At the end of the story, we have a leukoerythroid ratio 2.8. So, for the diagnosis, we use the percentage obtained in the myelogram, and we are in the, so is 20%, we are in the context of acute myeloid. Moving to the second myelogram, we have 25% of granulocytic series, blast 5%, erythroid 65, 4 lympho, 1 plasma, and the leukoerythroid ratio is negative, is 0.46. At this point, we have 5% of blast. We have to recalculate this percentage in the non-erythroid context. That means 5 for 100 divided for 30. 30 is exactly granulocytic series plus blast. It's the number you should exclude in the next context erythroid, lympho, plasma cell. So, in this case, your blast NEC is 16.6. So, you are in the context of RIB2. It's clear. This is an interactive course. This is a didactic. So if you have questions, if I say something that is not so clear, please ask. It's important to take home message and to follow the slides and the examples. In the third myelogram, we have 15% of granulocytic series, 4% of blasts, erythroids 76, 76, and 4 lymphocytes, 1 plasma cell. Again, I have a leukoerythroid ratio negative, 0.25. So I have to recalculate the blast percentage out of the NEC contest that in these cases is there is a mistake because it's the results I've checked this, but I didn't because the number it's okay, but this is out of 19, not 24, and here again we are in the contest with the 4% of blast of acute myeloid leukemia. So again, ANC means all nucleated cells of your myelogram. NEC, non-erythroid cells, lymphocyte and plasma cell are excluded. And this algorithm is reported in the WHO document. This is a scan from the document, and you see that this diagnostic algorithm, if we have erythroid precursors in bone marrow as or more than 50%, okay, you and in the bone marrow findings you have as 20 or more 20% of blasts in the all nuclear marrow cells. These cases meet criteria, and you have dysplasia. Meets criteria for myelodysplastic related changes. We are in this context. If we have erythroid precursors more than 80%, and we have few, if any, myeloblasts, and we have a minimal myelogranulocytic component, we are in the context of pure erythroid leukemia. If erythroid precursors are more than 50%, we have less than 20% of blasts in the blood, you should consider the recalculate percentage of ANC, and if the result is more than 20%, you are in the setting context of the acute erythroid or myeloid leukemia, and vice versa. If the blast percentage of the NEC is less than 20%, you are in the context of MDS. But, and this is a news in this classification, after you follow this algorithm and you are in this context, you should classify the subtype of MDS according to the percentage of the blasts obtained in the original myelogram, on the myelogram performed out of all nucleated cells. And this is if you, as for in the previous example, if you have 5% of blast and following this algorithm, you fall in the context of MDS, and you have a NEC percentage of 16, you should stratify the patient according to the 5% of blast, because it makes a difference in the biological context of different subsets in MDS. Up to now, we went through the morphologic quantitative criteria. Now we have, in this document, there are criteria in the morphological features of the cell. So, and again, we have to enumerate, because to define one lineage as a dysplastic one, we should enumerate at least 10% of the cells as, and we should identify these cells as having unequivocal dysplastic features. So again, we have to enumerate within each lineage. And this is the classification, and I have highlighted in red all the point in the list of these subtypes of disease, all the point where is required accuracy in the enumeration of the cells. And you see that we have numbers such as less than 1%, and again 5 to 9%, less than 5%. This is a slide just to underline how it's important to follow rules to stratify patients in the same way. So if we have rules, we should follow these rules. And again, also in these new entities, now including the new WHO classification, that is refractory cytopenia of childhood, again, we need to enumerate few blast cells, and to detect dysplasia, we should enumerate at least 10% of cells within each lineage having dysplastic feature. Moving to morphology, again, this document are provided details on the morphological appearance that allow us to identify a cell as a dysplastic one. Unfortunately, from my point of view, in this document, dysplastic features in peripheral blood are not mentioned in the diagnostic pathway. But I usually follow the rules because I prefer to be part of a consensus scientific setting. But based on my experience, in professional experience, we have some morphological features in peripheral blood, such as Pelger or pseudo-Pelger nucleus in neutrophils, such as some aspect in the red cells that, starting from peripheral blood, are high predictive of an MDS. Anyway, for the diagnosis, we should detect dysplasia on marrow cells, and this is nowadays the rule. In these documents are listed in a very detailed way all those morphological features which should be considered as dysplastic. Moving to the erythroid lineage, nuclear budding is a feature of dysplasia in the erythroid context. This means that I'm performing the myelogram and I enumerate these 4 cells as erythroid. All these 3 cells should be considered as dysplastic. So I enumerate 4 erythroid, out of these 3 dysplasia. At the end of the myelogram, if I have enumerated more or at least 10% of the erythroid cells as dysplastic, I am allowed to conclude my final report in the myelogram as dyserythropoiesis. Coming back to the morphological patterns, in the erythroid context, we have nuclear budding, internuclear bridging. Unfortunately, there is maybe that if we can decrease the light in this part, we could appreciate we could better appreciate the colors of the chromatin, which links the two nuclei of the two erythroid cells, that at the microscope we have the zeta axis. So we can go, okay, this is pink, okay, I recommend and I underline that the cytoplasmic intercytoplasmic bridge should not consider as dysplastic feature. Okay, we believe it. Again, karyoresis is the third images, that is fragmentation of nuclear chromatin. Multinuclearity, so this should be considered as dysplastic. Hyperlobulation, this is very clear images, that's different from the budding. This is hyperlobulation. Here, this is hyperlobulation because there is a short chromatin. Megaloblastic changes. Megaloblastic changes is asynchronous maturation and increased size of the cells. You see this very fine chromatin in this megaloblastic erythroblast. The presence of ring sideroblast, and I wish to underline that in the new classification the name is changed, because in the previous one we talk about ringed sideroblast. Now is well underlined the name, and this makes the difference if you go through the old documents. But this is the point, just to harmonize also the term of the cells. So ring sideroblast, and finally WHO accept this definition that is the same that was provided in 1976 from the ICSH. That is that in the you perform cytochemical staining with the pearls, and if you find 5 or more siderotic granules covering 1/3 or more of the rim of the nucleus, you should enumerate this as ring sideroblasts, and you should have more than 50%. Cytoplasmic vacuolization. This is a dyserythropoietic maturation with a lack of hemoglobinization in the cytoplasm, and at the microscope you see not stained zone vacuoles, and pus positivities in the erythroid cells. Moving to the morphological features which allow us to define one cell as dysplastic in the granulopoietic series, we have the first feature is presence of small or unusually large size cells, and you see difference in the same slide. This is a big one. This seems to be jolly-like corpuscle, and again you see how many lobes. Modification in the nuclear lobulation, in the sense of hypolobulation, pseudo-Pergeloy modification, and also the chromatin pattern of these cells are different from a normal segmented chromatin pattern. On the other side, hypersegmentation is again a morphological feature which allow us to define this cell as a dysplastic neutrophil. This is an eosinophil, dysplastic eosinophil. Lack of granules And in the documents is very well underlined, pay attention to the staining. If we perform staining with, for instance, panoptical bright, we can lose, in some case, the detection of granules. So, if you are going to define one lineage as dysplastic based on the lack of granules, be sure of your staining. Repeat the staining. Use May-Grunwald or be sure of the stain. And again, in the context of this granulopoiesis, the presence of these coalescent granules, pseudo-Chediak-Higashi granules. Hauer rods. The presence of Hauer rods. This is one Hauer rods, this another Hauer rods. If you find less than 9% of a blast, but you find at least one Hauer rod, and you are in the context of the diagnostic pathway for MDS, these cases should be, by definition, included into the group of the RIB2, irrespectively of the number of the blasts. So this is another point underlying this classification. Moving to the dysplastic feature, morphological features in the megakaryocytic context, we have to enumerate as dysplastic micro megakaryocytes. Nuclear hypolobulation is if this morphological appearance is the only one, this is high predictive of the presence of 5q- deletion. Multinuclearity, many nuclei in the megakaryocytes, and again, coming back to the classification, it's well detailed and listed what we have to consider a blast cells. This is the same slide we discussed before the images, but again, I underline that myeloblasts, monoblasts, and megakaryocytes should be included into the context of the blast enumeration. What's a myeloblast according to this new classification? We were very lucky because at the end of the story they deleted the type 3 blasts. That was really very difficult to find a consensus. So nowadays we have two types of blasts, a granular blast and granular blasts, which is the morphological marker to consider one cell as a granular blast or dysplastic promyelocyte or promyelocyte, the Golgi zone. The Golgi zone is the morphological hallmark that allow us to identify one cell as blast or as promyelocyte. Not the number of granules, not the basophilia of the cytoplasm, not the nucleoli in the nucleus. And this is, if we follow this rule, we cannot totally agree on this rule. We could not convince it on all the single cells, but this is really relevant because if we use a consensus morphological classification, we classify these patients in the same way everywhere. And this is the goal of a classification, to classify the same patients in the same way all over the lab in Europe and hopefully also out of Europe. And here again, so we have here this is a blast cell. Unfortunately, there is too much light, and here you see here there is a Golgi. You can appreciate here the chromatin that is an immature pattern, but it's there is too much light. And this is a dysplastic promyelocyte. What is a monoblast? Monoblasts are large cells, usually having abundant cytoplasm. Color of cytoplasm could be from light gray to deep blue. Nucleus is usually round, and the chromatin is very, very delicate, is very, very lacy. And usually there are nucleoli, prominent nucleoli. What is a promonocyte? Promonocyte has the same chromatin pattern of a monoblast, so delicate, lacy, but presenting some nucleus growed, folded. Nucleoli could be present or could be also absent, and moreover in the cytoplasm you can find some fine granules. So they are in the middle, because in the mature monocyte you can find granules, but the chromatin pattern is mature, and you can find in a typical monocyte a convoluted grooved nucleus, not well defined as normal monocyte. But the key, the morphologic key, is the chromatin pattern. Coming back to the monoblast, the key again is the chromatin pattern and the rim of the nucleus and the cell side that usually is larger. And here, this is a monoblast, and these are promonocytes. Monoblast again. Here on the screen it's better. These are promonocytes, these are monoblasts. And finally, in the WHO classification, there is include the enumeration of megakaryoplasts that are defined as medium to large size with a basophilic granular cytoplasm, round indented or irregular nucleus with the fine reticular chromatin, 1 to 3 nucleoli. This is reported in the document. From my point of view, these cells should be enumerated within the blast count, but from the microscopic identification, it's impossible to be sure that these are megakaryoplasts. So we go to the flow for the identification. So we enumerate these as blasts, and this is suggestive for megakaryoplasts. But when we do not have positive markers, peroxidase, our rods, to identify the lineage, we should perform flow. In this classification, there are news. One is the possibility to perform a diagnosis of MDS in absence of morphological dysplasia. And this is in the context of those patients presenting recurrent chromosomal abnormalities considered as presumptive evidence of MDS in patients presenting with cytopenia. And these are the abnormalities, unbalanced, balanced, that are listed. This means that you have a patient with cytopenia, you have not enough dysplasia in the series to report on the myelogram this erythropoiesis, this ganopoiesis, or this megakaryocytosis poiesis. You perform cytogenetics, you find these abnormalities, and this patient is classified as MDS. And again, in this new classification, there are pointed some difference and respect to the previous one. First of all, we are talking of refractory cytopenias with the unilineage dysplasia, which include the refractory anemia, neutropenia, or thrombocytopenia. The second news is that in the context of refractory cytopenia with the multilineage dysplasia, the presence of more than 50% ring sideroblast is not different, does not identify different subtypes. So you should just report. In the context of the RIB1, by definition, you should have less than 5% of blood cells in peripheral blood. It is important that, this is very important, that if you have blood cell in peripheral blood and less than 5% of blasts in bone marrow, and you fit the criteria, you classify the patients as RIB1. And again, you see how it's important to harmonize the enumeration and the differential in peripheral blood and in the myelogram. This is the subtype of unclassified myelodysplastic syndromes. You have less than 5% of blasts and equivocal dysplasia in less than 10%. In one or more myeloid cells, when accompanied by cytogenetic abnormalities, considered as correlated with the diagnosis of MDS. And this is the context of patient classified as MDS without having relevant dysplasia. Again, we have an additional category in this new classification, that is refractory cytopenia of childhood. Only in this context, children should be classified in a different way. Out of this context, children with 2 to 90% of blasts in peripheral blood or bone marrow should be stratified according to the rules of the adults. And at the end of this speech, there is this classification point out the attention on MDS of patient with MDS presenting with hypocellular or myelofibrotic bone marrow specimens. In this classification, this subset of patients are considered as a distinct entity, but the recommendation of this document tell us to perform the diagnostic pathway as an MDS, what we did until now, and to add as a comment in the final diagnostic in the final morphological diagnosis the terms hypoplastic or having myelofibrosis. So it's a descriptive way, no different subset. And finally, we are talking about this new entity, which is not included in the WHO classification, that is the idiopathic cytopenia of undetermined significance, IQOS. In this diagnostic set, there are included those patients having insufficient morphological of cytogenetic evidence for diagnosis of MDS, but this patient present with persistent cytopenia or mono-bio teenage cytopenias. IQOS should be used not as an entity in the WHO classification, but should be used for those patients who do not fulfill minimal requirement of the WHO criteria. In this patient should be followed very careful to be ready in the case of the emergence of those morphological or cytogenetical evidence which allow us to make the diagnosis of MDS. And again, in the literature, there are reported 2 cases of IDUS, which is idiopathic dysplasia of unknown significance. And in the literature are reported differences between patients with IQOS and IDUS. In the IQOS setting, we have cytopenia marked constant. The threshold are those of the IPSS, and you should have cytopenia for at least 6 months, excluding all other underlying causes. Obviously, we have no MDS criteria, no dysplasia, no karyotype, and no other reasons sustaining the cytopenia. This is the IQOS criteria. In the IDUS criteria, the same with cytopenia, but we have dysplasia or karyotype and without other disease. IQOS usually are older patients with a low EPO level, and with the fish, very often we found a very small clone. While in this context we have younger patients, and occasionally detected, and starting from morphological dysplastic patterns, usually pseudopelvic nuclei or sustained macrocytosis. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Gina. Please, questions?
Questions?
Or comments? So I would start. You said that bone marrow aspiration should be very careful and no more than 1 ml.
No more than 0.5.
0.5
ml. 1 ml is too much.
And how well clinicians follow these rules?
How in my university hospital they do this. In Italy, within the SIE, Italian Society of Hematology, we have a strong group of methodology. So hopefully, we hope that this is done. In the context of the MDS Foundation from John Bennett, this rule is included, and this is. I don't know. How do you collect just 1 sample and then you make aliquots, or what? What's your experience in your labs? Or you get different samples from bone marrow aspiration? What do you do?
Yes, I think it depends on patient. In some patients, it's 1 aspiration with aliquots, and if there is difficult to get samples, it's several aliquots.
I understand, but the point is that maybe the difficult patients should go to the trephine biopsy, because otherwise, if you have material that is not enough, you can give a look and to provide a report which is just qualitative. But if the sample is dilute, there is no sense to provide a percentage, because it's wrong. When you go in the context of marrow biopsy, you will find the real number and the real pattern of distribution in the bone marrow. Anna, what do you think?
A microphone here. Ene.
I think that every patient that is evaluated for MDS should have bone marrow biopsy performed, because bone marrow biopsy gives you more information about the distribution of blasts in the bone marrow, how you look at, if they are in groups, clusters, aggregates, and it also gives much better evaluation of megakaryocytes. According to WHO, one should evaluate at least 25 to 30 megakaryocytes, and it can be difficult to find in the smears. So this megakaryopoiesis is much easier to evaluate on bone marrow biopsy. And also it can give you information on the bone marrow stroma that can be quite unhealthy in MDS patients, and it gives additional information. So basically, I think that usually for MDS patients, one does not only one bone marrow study, but usually it is a question of follow-up, and before one makes a diagnosis, to see that pancytopenia is persisting. So probably the first, if one does aspirate first and thinks that it is MDS suspicion, then the second one, bone marrow study, in my opinion, should be also including bone marrow biopsy.
I fully agree. In our department, we do perform bone marrow aspirate following these rules, but we do perform from the first step also marrow biopsy. But this is complementary information, because for the diagnostic pathway we use marrow aspirate, but we do we do in the same context also bone marrow biopsy, and as Anna has very well underlined, this is very important also for the follow-up of the patients, because you appreciate the difference of some evidence, ALIP or reticular fibrin, fibrosis, and so and so. So this is, I agree, but and we do this. But in the diagnostic pathway, we should perform a blast enumeration and categorization in those patients by using bone marrow aspirate. This is, yes.
I have one more question, since I have the
yes,
microphone.
Please.
This category of IDOS that you discussed in the end of your presentation, it is, I don't understand really how it is with the karyotype, because basically if one reads the WHO, then if one finds a pathological karyotype that is consistent with MDS, then we can make a diagnosis. So do the patients who has a karyotype really can go to the IDOS category, or is it already MDS? I'm not clear on this point.
If you know very well that there was a lot of discussion of which abnormalities we have been excluded from the from those abnormalities which are considered linked to the MDS. The paper with the major collection of patients was published quite simultaneously. So it's your question is totally correct, because in the IDUS context, IDUS with dysplasia follows those patients having karyotypic abnormalities, not those strictly listed in the new WHO classification, but usually founded in the MDS patients. But this is, up to my knowledge, the situation of these two groups. Oh, please.
What are the WHO recommendations for the follow-up for the morphological and cytogenetic changes that could happen in the IDUS or ICOS patients? So how frequent should we do so? As to follow up with for the morphological is easy, but for cytogenetics maybe costly, because in Egypt sometimes the resources are not that good. So, and the first question the parent will ask about, how frequent should we come and visit and do the laboratory investigation again? So.
Okay, the point is, first of all, we are in the diagnostic context. So we have cytopenia, no? We perform and we decide that is an MDS. At this point, patient is certified and is followed according to the certification. In this context, you follow the rules that are in my day hospital, because patients are not inpatients, are the hospital patients. And they do perform a control at the first time each 1 or 2 months, and after this, when we are sure that is a quite stable situation, okay, they can come each 3 months, and after 1 year from the diagnosis, we have meeting on these patients, and we decide if go on in repeating or in delaying those very expensive tests. So there is a sort of target surveillance. There are not strictly rule. Concerning the ICOS, it's another story. In ICOS patients is very strictly followed, and usually also every 4 weeks. Also every 4, and sometimes they send us a fax with a peripheral blood count to try, and we ask if the patients prefer to perform a peripheral blood count out of our hospital, we ask for a strictly microscopic revision, looking for pseudopelgary, looking for enumeration of this aspect, and obviously based on the number of neutrophils or platelets, but it's strictly followed, this one, because it's a bomb. You know. Is this the question? Yes.
More questions? IDUS, how often do you see this? IDUS.
I read the paper. I was not able to identify, but in the story of my professional life, when you read something, then you find it. And yes, and if you know, you find. If you don't know, you miss. So we wait for. Okay.
I have one more question
Please.
about guidelines. I see age guidelines. How well they are known or adopted?
I hope in the scientific context they are discussed, adopted, and shared. How in the trials, in the clinical trials, there is a central revisor group, so they are adopted. In the single lab, I think that these educational activities, tutorials, may improve and convince people to follow the rule for the best outcome of the patients.
And you would like to comment, Anna? No. Is this guidelines? Bone marrow. Yes, how to take cancer marrow. This stage guidelines you mentioned last year and Gina now.
I think that they are quite followed. Basically, when I talk to people, and it seems that they have been well read, and I think that they are followed. There was a big discussion about if WHO should be followed by the clinicians. They were not so when the 2001 came, but I think that by now after 10 years they got used to it, so they're following it too.
Yes, maybe that this is a time with the crisis, and when there is a crisis in terms of resource, we go back to the microscope. So maybe this is an opportunity, because the documents is well known and well spread all over the world. So now we have to be convinced to follow these rules, and maybe that if we follow this rule, we can also spare some money in performing not very useful tests, in not very useful. So it's something that work together.
I have only also one more question, and I'd like to know your opinion. There were a couple of papers last year about the possibility of using the hematology analyzers to see to pick out patients that
we use it
could be MDS. Could you comment on that? If you think it is useful, and maybe it should be used more than it is?
Thank you for the question, because this is the other life, my professional life. We have a research center for the evaluation of automated instruments in hematology, so we are expert in all the new software of the instrument, and the new instruments, the new generation of the instruments do really provide very accurate and specific flags for morphological flags. They are really able to provide distribution curves in the red cells, and you see that not only that the RDV, red distribution wide is increased, but because this is a number, but if you see the curve distribution, you see that is compounded from two different populations or more, and the same from the distribution of cluster cells of the granulocytic, because according to the technology which is or impedantiometry or optical, there is a different pattern according to the presence of granules or a chromatin pattern. And again, now in this new instrument, in the new version of the instruments, there is all the companies changed the range to enumerate a platelet. And for instance, there are some new parameters that are the immature fraction of platelet that is very important for screening from the normal routine blood count, those abnormal pattern. You make a screen, and then you make the contest of these patients, and you go on. Because nowadays, obviously, it's important to make a diagnosis when there is the evidence of the disease. But nowadays, our professional life obliged us to make diagnosis well in advance. The best way to make a diagnosis of the patient is when the patient does not know that is ill and perform just a normal check. Because now we have an offers of therapies, and these therapies are more efficient as more health is the patients. So it's our professional challenge. But unfortunately, I can talk about the situation in Italy. The lab, in terms of using of counters, automatic counters is separated from the hematology department that they do perform bone marrow aspirate, myelogram, and fish cytogenetic and flow. So it's difficult to. I am one of the person who usually in my country make a link between these two realities, because it happens that in my university, within the department of the hematology lab is centralized, so that serves all the hospital, is in the department of hematology. So this is the reason, because I'm so informed in detail of the news in the lab.
Yeah, it is where I worked in Sweden. It also was that the analyzers were under the clinical chemistry department, and the morphology, cytology of bone marrow was under pathology. But where I work now, it is the department of laboratory hematology. So analyzers are in the same department, and then when it is flagged, then it goes to the hematopathologist for morphological assessment. So it is starting to coming up that these patients can be
selected pick up very in advance. Yes, we have a lot of parameters, a lot of very useful parameters. And again, and we can close comment on this, it's also possible now with the technology to put the rules, in the sense that you put the rules in your system according to age, no previous delta check or not delta check in patients, and the systems pick up this to you. At the end of the day, highlight those hemograms having the flag that you required for. So you go on with the routine, but at the end you have a list of those peripheral blood analysis which falls within the rules that you can assign. So if you speak with the lab people, and or if you have the lab, it's the best for the patients. It's really the best. Okay.
I have one comment.
Please.
Maybe you can. You are driving force of this consensus panel of cells or morphological database, which is also available in EHA website.
Yes.
So please, can you say some words?
Yes, we and Anna was within the panel, and Barbara too. Within the LeukemiaNet project, we in the working package number 10. That is the diagnostic package. There is the morphology group and the flow group, and we work. The project is now ended. It was carried out for 6 years, and we produced a consensus atlas of morphological images, and this atlas is available in the LeukemiaNet website. But because I'm also in charge of the IETO platform in the ICA website, through the ICA there is a link to this set of cells. It's very interesting because you have the cells and which are numbered, so you are unequivocally identified, and you have a sheet, an Excel sheet, where there is written how these cells were named by a consensus group of morphology, and there is also written which one of these cells didn't reach the full consensus at the first round. So when you see the cell, when there is a red circle in the number, it means that to obtain the consensus, there was a discussion, and we had also a meeting, today's meeting in Nancy, discussing this. Now we are trying together with Marie-Christine Benet to ask to be part of a scientific working group of the ICA. Okay, thank you. It's exactly this one. You see that here this cell was discussed. This cell reached the consensus at the first round. At the end of this, if you go down, yes. Video, yes. And this is, so it's the link under education. There is a link with the L morphological database. If you go down, these are the cells. You can enlarge the cell. Go down, please. And here, please go down, go down, go down. And at the end, you can download this. That is a table of the name of the cell. And you can you can exercise by yourself and you can find how this cell was named by a consensus workshop. And now I hope that we could continue. First of all, there will be in October a morphological meeting on 21st of October in Munich, and this could be very interesting. And we are going to submit this group of morphologists in and also flow. And yesterday we discussed with Anna to include also biopsy, bone marrow biopsy in the diagnostic context. And we asked to be part of the scientific workshops of the ICA, just to have the opportunity to continue to work together. Okay, so let's move to the clinical case, please. This is the first case, and this is a case of a 57-year-old white man. He presented with a sudden appearance of progressive fatigue, dyspnea, swelling, ankle edema, and weight of loss. No previous illness were reported, and he didn't want or like to consume meat anymore. When he was recorded, when he performed at the end of the August full blood count and showing anemia and leukopenia and thrombocytopenia, with a very high increase of lactate dehydrogenase, increase of total bilirubin, and increase of erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and a slight hypogamma globulinemia. With this anemia, patient was immediately hospitalized in a medical division. Mild hepatomegaly and marked splenomegaly at clinical examination was detected, and he was supported with blood transfusion, 3 units, and it was supported by folinic acid. This was a department of medical division. He underwent abdominal ultrasonography, which confirmed the spleen enlargement. At this point, patient was referred to our hematological department. So it's 6 days later, because it was at the end of the August. At the admission, he was paid, dysphenoic and mild scleral icterus, afebrile, with normal blood pressure and normal pulse rate. Liver and spleen were enlarged and respectively 1 to 5 centimeters below the rim, the costal edge. And this is this instrumental report. And this is instrumental report performed by Siemens Technology, which is which use a laser, so it's an optical technology, and use automated cytochemistry. And here, white blood cells are displayed according to the volume and the content of peroxidase. So these are neutrophils, and these are cells negative to peroxidase, that are lymphocyte monocytes. Here are included those large cell, because it's volume negative to the peroxidase. Here are monocytes, here are eosinophil. While in the basophilic channel, all the cells were submitted to lysis, and basophils are resistant to the lysis. So here are enumerated basophil. Here are displayed the nuclei of the lysed cells according to the chromatin pattern, because this is an optical system. So if the chromatin is very condensed, here are the nuclei. If the chromatin is less condensed, here are the nuclei. If the chromatin is very lazy, they fall out of this threshold, and the system do provide a flag for suspect of blast, and the system enumerate blast. This is just to illustrate how the analyzer reports are so sophisticated nowadays. Coming back to our patients, it was confirmed leukopenia. There was enumerated percentage of blood cells, and platelet thrombocytopenia and anemia. He was transfused, if you remember. And this is another instrumental report. This is performed by Sysmex, and in this system there is a dedicated channel for the enumeration of NRBC, nuclear red blood cells. So you see that here it's the same patients, no, with another analyzer. You have exactly the number of nuclear red blood cell out of the white blood cell, and this system in this channel does enumerate the number of immature granulocytes. So you see you have a lot of information. And again, and both systems, all the systems do provide retics count, but do provide also the immature retics fraction. That means those retics which are delivered from the bone marrow within the past 6 hours. So it's a very important information. And again, we have also the hemoglobin content of the retics. This means that if this generation of retics is produced in iron deficiency, these parameters is the first one which change. Not at the beginning is this the parameter, this change. I provided this information because that could be useful for you for one of the test cases that will follow. This is the peripheral blood smear of our patients. Now I want to come back because, okay, I wish to underline that we have anemia with reticulocytopenia, with immature fraction 0, are all low fluorescence. That means old reticulocytes, MCV less than 90, and these are the parameters useful. And this is the smears, and you see that there are some ovalocytes, some macrocytes, and some microspherocytes. You know that at a microscope, to evaluate the size of cell, you should point out one small lymphocyte. Usually we have T small lymphocyte in peripheral blood, and the nucleus of this small lymphocyte should be at least larger, 1.5 more than a normal erythroid cells. And if you have the reference, no, you see that there is a sort of double population with these macro-ovalocytes. And again, in this peripheral blood smear, if you remember that there was leukopenia, there was quite a neutrophil with dysplastic segmentation in sense of hypersegmentation. And again, in the blood smear, I have enlarged. This is a sort of metamyelocyte, but it's very, very, very large, very huge. If you remember the system, in the Sysmex report, there were enumerated immature granulocytes and nucleated red cell. And again, you see here there is a orthochromatic erythroblast. So the full blood count was as from the report: hemoglobin 7 and white blood cell 0.9 and platelet 35. This is the MCV. Retics 0.2. IRF in the second was 3.2, and Rete, that is the content of retics, was at the maximum, no, of our lab range. This was the differential. And at clotting test, we have normal fibrinogen, and we have a slight decreased antithrombin, while we have the very increased D-dimer value. We have a normal range of less than 300. Biochemical tests were normal except for uric acid, bilirubin, lactate dehydrogenase, aptoglobin at low normal value, and total protein was slightly decreased, and there was no detection of monoclonal paraprotein. Serum iron was low, but within the range. Total iron binding capacity was low, but within the range, and ferritin was normal. This was the report of the bone marrow. Cellularity was hypercellular with normal iron stores, with normal megakaryocytes. This was the myelogram. With this, the ratio. Increased number of macrophages with the debris. Comment: 3 lineage dysplasia, megaloblastosis and cell gigantism. No tumor cells are observed. And finally, the morphological diagnosis. This was fitting with the aspect, morphological aspect of vitamin B12 or folic acid deficiency causing megaloblastic anemia. I underline that the MCV was normal, but this was when we perform the myelogram, we have to conclude with the morphological diagnosis. Morphological diagnosis is the clinician that at the end, by using all, perform the final diagnosis. So the morphological diagnosis, and we will go through these images, was suggestive, indicates or show those morphological abnormalities that fit with the B12 or folic acid deficiency. So we have increased cellularity, and you see the hyperlobulation of this is megakaryocytes, and you know that this is one of the criteria of dysplasia in the WHO. And again, here we see just to see how this is very large. And okay, here we see abnormalities in the segmentation of the mature neutrophils. And here you see this is a giant band form. And we have increased in the size of the cells at the middle stage of maturation. This is a morphological hallmark for megaloblastic change. And here you see two megaloblasts with asynchronous maturation, very fine dispersed reticulated chromatin, and hyperbasophilic cytoplasm. And again, these are other megaloblastic changes. And again, you see abnormalities in segmentation. So we saw dysplasia in all the three lineages, if granulocytic, megakaryocytic, and those megaloblastic changes. But due to the some hallmark that are hypersegmentation, giant metamyelocytes, and typical red blood cells, the morphological conclusion oriented to a deficiency. Other tests. Serum folinic, you remember that in the medical admission they do provide folic acid, and so this was the result of serum folinic acid. Vitamin B12 was absolutely low, homocysteine was increased, and all the tests for celiac disease were negative, and the gastric endoscopy demonstrated chronic atrophic gastritis of the fundus and a presence of a polypoid lesion. And with the biopsy, the diagnosis was of well differentiated gastric adenocarcinoma. If you remember, in the history of the patients, there was that he referred that he didn't like more to eat meat. That is a clinical symptoms of this. At this point, we have all the things. Now we had bone marrow compatible, biochemical test compatible, biopsy with the final diagnosis, megaloblastic anemia in gastric adenocarcinoma. But this is not a satisfactory diagnosis, because not all the aspects of this patient do fit with the diagnosis. There are the MCV, which was an anemia, normocytic, normal iron status, and normal Rete. You remember the content of hemoglobin was normal. So you have to make a differential diagnosis with the iron deficiency anemia, and it was not the case. Anemia of chronic disease, ferritin was increased, but not so increased, because this is not marked. And having this MCV, you should perform electrophoresis. Otherwise, it's inexplicable why megaloblastic anemia with a low MCV or normal MCV. The other peculiar features which should be explained to be sure that this that was the correct diagnosis is the presence of leukoerythroblastosis. There were circulating NRBC. This is not typical. If you remember, metastatic cancer cells were not detected neither nor in the bone marrow aspirate, neither in the biopsy. So why he had leukoerythroblastosis? So we should have marrow infiltration, and also in the bone marrow aspirate. So we should perform marrow biopsy to exclude that leukoerythroblastosis is sustained by marrow infiltration. And The third aspect which does not fit is splenomegaly. Why you have splenomegaly? Why this patient do have splenomegaly? Outcome. The patient was treated with vitamin B12 and he was found to be a beta thalassemia carrier. This was the electrophoresis. Marrow biopsy was negative from presence of cancer cells. And at this point, I went through the literature and I found that there are reports that in case of severe megaloblastic anemia, leukoerythroblastosis is reported. While splenomegaly is rare in beta thalassemia, while is well known in patients with severe megaloblastic anemia. The point is that nowadays very rare to find a patient presenting with a severe B12 or folic deficiency, because usually now you intercept the diagnosis before a severe grade of anemia. So we are not used to see so many splenomegaly, how they are reported in the literature, in papers, very old papers, not in the recent literature. So this patient was discharged from our department with therapy with B12 and waiting for onco evaluation. Platelets, leukocytes, hemoglobin recovered, and after the treatment, he reached his MCV as a thalassemia carrier that was lower than the CV at presentation, slightly lower. On October, he was submitted to gastrectomy, and at that time, so from August to October, by the abdominal ultrasound, the spleen size reversed to normal. And this is the proving that it was due to B12 deficiency. So we have 2 slides of comments. On this case, vitamin B12 deficiency is one of the main causes of megaloblastic anemia, which could be caused by inadequate intake, malabsorption resulting from inadequate secretion of intrinsic factor or presence of chloridria, or interference, drugs interference with the DNA synthesis, so diuretic, chemotherapeutic agents, anti-inflammatory agents, anticonvulsivant. Uncomplicated megaloblastic anemia is diagnosed when we have an increase in MCV associated with the pancytopenia of variable degree. Differential diagnosis should be made with the non-megaloblastic macrocytic anemias that can be associated with several conditions such as accelerated erythropoiesis, alcoholism, liver disease, hypothyroidism, aplastic anemia, old dyserythropoietic anemia, MDS, or other malignancies. The presence, and we had these images on the peripheral blood of oval macrocytes and hypersegmented neutrophils on peripheral blood film, is a clue for the diagnosis. And this is the morphological clue reported in all the textbooks. So we have to think about this and to know this. Megaloblastic anemia with a normal mean corpuscular volume occurs in patients with coexisting thalassemia or coexisting iron deficiency, or patients with anemia of chronic disease. So it is very important to include peripheral blood film examination in the diagnostic procedures for patients with anemia, and to look for hypersegmented neutrophils on blood film, which is the real hallmark of megaloblastic anemia. The last comment is on splenomegaly. Splenomegaly is reported in pernicious anemia in early studies of this disease. In the first half of the 20th century, the incidence was reported from 3 to 45%, with a size moving range from 3 to 14 centimeters below the left costal rims. Reports, including palpable splenomegaly in patients with pernicious anemia, declined after the introduction of liver therapy, followed by the B12 therapy, so declined in this era. In 1940, so after the introduction of this therapy, there is a report of an incidence of less than 3% on a study carried out on 200 patients. So is this the reason we are not used to see splenomegaly in megaloblastic anemia? Because it's rare that a patient presents at beginning with a so high degree of B12 deficiency. The other point was the leukoerythroblastosis, which is associated up to 75% of cases with the malignancies, while prevalence in pernicious anemia is reported 1 to 20% of patients. So it is possible. Hematological abnormalities are present in more than 80% of patients with B12 deficiency, and a severe pancytopenia is present. Should be made a differential diagnosis with the acute leukemia. In conclusion, in our patients, all the findings suspicious for metastatic cancer or leukemia were caused just from his severe vitamin B12 deficiency, while the coexisting thalassemic trait masked the increased macrocytosis, the increased MCV. And after this review of the literature, I went to the textbook, the recent textbook, and very rare is mentioned this association. So in a context of training or in hematological diagnosis, it's important to have in mind that in presence of some morphological positive unequivocal images, hypersegmented circulating hypersegmenting neutrophils, also in presence of a normal or low MCV, we should have in our mind an algorithm to exclude or include the vitamin B12 deficiency. Do we have questions on this case?
So there was no family history of thalassemia with this patient?
Yes, I don't remember really, but we did perform the electrophoresis, and so I don't remember his family history. But in Rome we have a center for thalassemia, so all the patients that are presenting abnormalities in electrophoresis are directions to this center for familial studies. So I believe that it did.
But this splenomegaly and leukoerythroplastosis, does it mark that hematopoiesis goes to spleen in these severe cases, or is it extramedullary hematopoiesis, or is it just? So.
This is a case that it happens. It's a real case, and I went to the literature. I went back to the literature because obviously after the biochemical assess there was no B12. I have morphology. Okay, the next step is electrophoresis, but why splenomegaly? Why leukoerythroblastosis? Patient has no cancer cells in the bone marrow, and so we go back to the literature. Why splenomegaly? Maybe that is because all the deficiency anemia, you have substitution of erythropoiesis and myelopoiesis, and the fact that this reverse after therapy is in favor of this mechanism. But we didn't do other studies, no.
I have a question about this high value of D dimers.
Why?
Why was it done?
Maybe for the tumors.
Maybe due to tumors. Didn't you think about the possible thrombosis of tumor in some vein and the splenomegaly?
But the dimer by sure was for the tumors. Splenomegaly, it was not due to the tumors. It was tested because it reversed when it was solved the megaloblastic anemia. So this is the, and is described in the literature, but that's all. I have no other extra comments. Please.
So how long did it take for the CBC laboratory stuff to be recovered after the subtotal gastrectomy? Like you said, after the spleen reside to the normal size again?
In October. No, you see, I have the timing. So it start. The point is that we were lucky because the medical department was inside our university. Hematology was inside, and surgery was inside. So it was possible to follow the patients because I have a central lab, so I saw the hemograms, so I was able to follow. So the time is exactly that one that I present. So he was immediately, it was August, in September it was submitted, in October everything was okay. So it's very, very, very quick. But he was lucky because he found all in the same, he never left the hospital. In a different context, I believe that it would take more time. Also because when you go in another hospital, usually they restart to evaluate the patients, so more resources and more time. But in this case, it was for him it was perfect because in medicine, hematology, because the suspicious was hematology, surgery, and then oncology, the hospital of oncology for the follow-up. But we lose the patients. We are in the middle.
And he had no neurological manifestation for vitamin B12 deficiency, right? I'm just. Yeah.
In these patients, if I didn't name, if I don't name, no, I don't remember. But the question is very, 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 very relevant. Remember that at the first admission, folic acid was done. That means that maybe that. Someone thought about, so maybe that something happened. Okay, let's move to the second clinical case. Thank you. This is a case of a 69-year-old man with a previous history of untreated benign prostatic hypertrophy, brucellosis, surgical prosthesis on the left hip. He had a family history for carcinoma, father with prostatic carcinoma, mother with, thank you, uterine carcinoma, and daughter with ovarian carcinoma. At present history, he presented with progressive fatigue, growing testicular lump, starting from 1 month before the admission. In May, patient was hospitalized in orthopedics unit for fever, pain on the left shoulder due to a previous trauma, and by using echography, it revealed the presence of a joint effusion with subacromial ischiation. After routine blood test, patient was transferred to our hematological department. At the admission, he presented with mild gingival hypertrophy, slight enlargement of bilateral inguinal lymph nodes, and bilateral testicular edema. Absence of organomegaly, no hepatomegaly, no splenomegaly. Again, this is the peripheral blood count. Here you see there is leukopenia and MCV normal, hemoglobin anemia 8.8, and very low platelet count. And if you see in this box where are classified those large cells negative to the peroxidase, we have 16% of cells fall in this box. But as we told before, these cells, nuclei of these cells are mature because they do not fall here. So there is, within the morphological flags, are reported presence of atypical cells, nucleated red blood cells, immature granulocytes, but not blood cells. So this is very easy because this system, by using peroxidase, volume, and chromatin pattern, immediately orient the morphological flags. Obviously, you cannot never perform a diagnosis without going to the slide. This is by sure. But you can make the screening by using the system. So we have normocytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, leukopenia, flags for atypical lymphocytes, and RBC, and immature granulocytes. The manual differential was neutrophil 14%, 61% of lymphocytes, 4% of monocytes, confirmed presence of immature precursors, 16% of blast cells positive on myeloperoxidase staining and granulocytic dysplasia, and RBC present and circulating. Which was the point here? That, okay, we go on. These are the atypical neutrophils in the peripheral blood. And again, you see lack is very bad in the morphology, but many abnormalities in granulation is fine granules, very few, and you see here there are these vacuoles, and then we will see, and these are the blasts. The blasts are positive to the myeloperoxidase, and here there is immature granulocytes, and the system, because this is, I want to go back, here are the blasts, because these are high volume, positive to the peroxidase. So no blast negative to the peroxidase, but a pattern of people working with this system in presence of this directly move to the slide. Here, this could be a plot also of a patient with infectious mononucleosis. Here, this is a plot that could be of patients with growing factor treatment, immature granulocyte, blast, not promyelocyte, because promyelocyte falls on this side of the cytogram. So you looking at the cytogram, you have an idea. before going to the smear. And again, on the smear, there were circulating nucleated red blood cell with clearly dysplastic features. This is a platelet. You don't appreciate the color, but this is a platelet. Normal routine blood tests were normal except for increased erythrocyte sedimentation rate, prothrombin time. INR was slight increased, very slight increased. The normal PTT increased the dimer, increased lactate dehydrogenase, increased serum lysozyme, increased glucose, and increased reactive C protein. Bone marrow aspirate. Hypercellular bone marrow, we have tri-lineage dysplasia with the increased number of mitosis. Many monstrous cells with a high nuclear hyperploidia. Several images of erythrophagocytosis, and we will see why those vacuoles, what they were. Rare megakaryocytes, and the final myelograms was neutrophil series 58%, as in erythroid series 25%, and 11% of blood cells positive to myeloperoxidase. And these are the cells. These are monstrous cells. This is blast with the granules. And if you see this, and again this, this is a granulocytic cell. There was specific erythrophagocytosis, and at the end, in circulating neutrophils in peripheral blood, there were those vacuoles. Again, you see these cells with the vacuoles. So it was not an artifact, because sometimes you should be sure that what you see in peripheral blood is not due to storage time from the withdrawal and the smear. And again, you see how big, how monstrous these cells are. You see how many nuclei in the erythroid lineage, how hyperdiploid, and again here there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 lobes. It's a eosinophil, and again this is a blast cell positive to the myeloperoxidase with vacuoles, phagocytic vacuoles with one red blood cells, and again you see this, it's a neutrophil, and you see it's a tetraploid cells for mitosis. And again, for hyperdiploid cells, granulocytic cells, you see, 4 nuclei. And you see, if you see here, how many chromosomes, this is monstrous chromosomes patterns. And again, also in the context of megakaryocytes, you see how many polyploids these cells are. Going through the flow, quindi going through the this zone, that is this zone, the blast zone, we have 12% of total events included in this, that is the gate of the blast. And from the point of view of the flow, this was CD13, CD34, CD34 and CD32, and there were blasts expressing CD13 and CD33. So myeloid blasts. This is the karyotype. You see how many chromosomes and how monstrous is this karyotype. This is the fish analysis, no? 4 copies of chromosome 7. Here we have 4 green signals for the del5P and 4 copies of the MLL gene. Final diagnosis. Following the rule is the refractory anemia with excess of blasts, type 2 according to WHO, 60% of blasts, or 11 in the bone marrow. But in the new WHO classification is not mentioned the near tetraploid leukemia, acute myeloid leukemia. So following the rules, this case should be classified in this way, and according to the prognostic score, the score was high, a total score 3 points, and this is a case in 2005, so it's now something's changing, but he's underwent in a trial, in Italian trial versus conventional with AZA versus conventional therapy. Obviously nowadays it will be immediately treated in another in another manner. Outcome: sedimentation, erythroid sedimentation rate and hemostatic parameters within normal range at the follow-up. After the first cycle of cytarabine, patient developed severe infectious complication, and so he was withdrawn from the study. From July, he was treated just with supportive therapy. In August, he had a rapid leukemic evolution with blast count in the marrow up to 23%, same monstrous morphology, and he had comorbidities, complication, and he died in September for cerebral hemorrhage, probably to thrombocytopenia. So, comments on this case. It was a terrible case. You saw the cytogenetics, and the near tetraploid leukemias are absolutely very sad leukemias. And as final comment, we point that RIB2 is defined by this percentage of blasts, 10 to 19 in bone marrow and 5 to 19 in peripheral blood. This is a point that the presence of rods in blasts qualifies a case as RIB2 irrespective of the blast percentage. We said this in the speech. RIB account about 40% of MDS and affects primarily individuals over 50 years age. 30 to 50% of patients have clonal cytogenetic abnormalities that are trisomy 8, deletion 5q, monosomy 7, deletion 7, deletion 20q. But may also be observed some more complex karyotype. Progression is observed in 32% of RIB2, that was our patients, and 25% of patients classified as RIB1. The median survival is approximately 16 and 9 months in RIB1 and RIB2 respectively. In RIB2, this is another point underlined in the classification, that is that in RIB2, patients with 5 to 90% blasts in peripheral blood have a median survival of 3 months, similar to that of the AML with the dysplasia-related changes. So maybe that from a biological point of view, we are talking of the same disease in different chronological stage. And while cases defined, this was an history that was observed from the FAB era, that the presence of overload in MDS patients carry a better prognosis respect the same patients without, and it's confirmed nowadays that cases defined as RIB2 based only on the presence of our roads have an increased median survival. The risk of thrombohemorrhagic complication, our patient died for cerebral hemorrhage in all types of acute leukemias, has been extensively investigated. Coagulation abnormalities consistent with disseminated intravascular coagulation are reported not only in the lab in the acute promyelocytic leukemia, but also in T lymphoblastic leukemia. A patient with MDS may be at increased risk of developing cerebral venous thrombosis caused by the underlying hematologic abnormality caused to the therapy and to the potential evolution in transformation in leukemia. And another chapter that is very important, and there is now a lot of literature, is the Eva by sure we talk about this, the link between the MDS and inflammation, and in the context of MDS expert, this is a new topic that is present in the literature. Going back to our patients and going back to the near tetraploid acute leukemia, if you go through the literature, this is an unusual presentation, and the definition of near tetraploid leukemia is the presence in the blood cell of a number 8 to more than 100 chromosomes. In the literature, very few cases, only about 60 cases were described. We described one, just the before these cases, not these cases. It was another one, the previous one. Near tetraploid blood cells are characterized by the large size, homomarrow smear, but individual chromosome abnormalities are often difficult to analyze because they have a so-called fuzzy appearance. WHO criteria identified 14 AML with the multilineage and 11 with the single lineage dysplasia in a group of 25 patients studied by the age group, studying for the ploidity of the blood cells. While in another study, for Myelodysplastic syndrome patients with the 3 tetraploid had a significantly worse prognosis than those patients presenting with diploid cytogenetics. In B-cell neoplasm, triploidy was associated with a worse prognosis than tetraploid and diploid. These are the data now presented in the literature. These are the reference. And this is all, and it's open for question, discussion. Did you met these patients? Never. Never. So very, but you see that for morphology, monstrous and cytogenetics and karyotype. Did you have a comment, question, something that I skipped?
So there was probably some kind of inherited or familial unstable genetic
the
disorder.
story of the genetic cancer, yes. The daughter, the father, and this, by sure there is a chromosomal instability in the genetics of this family. Yes. Okay. We are ready for the break.
Thank you, Gina.
No, thank you for the attention.